Good morning, dear students. Today's topic is sulfur cycle. Sulfur cycle is the collection of process by which sulfur moves between rocks, waterways and living system. Sulfur is one of the most abundant and essential element on the earth. It is a constituent of many proteins and cofactors. Sulfur compounds can be used as oxidants or reductants in microbial respiration. Global sulfur cycle involves the transformation of sulfur through different oxidation states which play an important role in both geological and biological processes. So sulfur cycle, it is a collection of process in which the elemental sulfur, it moves between the abiotic and the biotic environment. It moves between abiotic environments such as rock and water into the biotic system, that is the living system comprising of microorganisms, plants and animals. So sulfur cycle, it is the cyclic process in which the elemental sulfur is cycled between the biotic environment and the abiotic environment. So the biotic environment in which the sulfur cycle present is all the living organism, and the abiotic environment is mainly the ocean and the atmosphere, the geosphere. This form the abiotic environment. Sulfur, it is one of the most abundant element on the earth, and it is the major constituent of many biological molecules, especially it is present in amino acids. So it is an important constituent of protein and cofactors, and sulfur compounds can be used as oxidants or reductants in microbial respiration. We have heard of this purple sulfur bacteria, green sulfur bacteria, etc. So they are photosynthetic bacteria, but they are not depending upon this water as their hydrogen source. They depend upon sulfur as a major source of energy. So such type of bacteria, they depend upon the sulfur for their cellular respiration. So the global sulfur cycle involves transformation of sulfur through different oxidation state which play an important role in geological and biological process. So sulfur, it is not only an important component in this biotic environment, it is also an essential element in the abiotic environment. So this sulfur cycle, it involves transformation of sulfur into various sulfur compounds like sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfate, sulfate, etc. and it is been deposited or it is been cycled through this biological as well as geological materials. Reservoirs of sulfur. In earth, the sulfur is mainly present in ocean, geosphere, biosphere and atmosphere. Ocean. Majority of the sulfur is found in seawater as salt or buried deep in ocean in the oceanic sediments. Example, pyrite rich shales, evaporate rocks and carbonate associated sulfate. So in ocean, the sulfur is present in the form of salt, and it is also seen buried in the oceanic sediments, and it is associated with the carbonate rocks. And the geosphere, sulfur is stored in the underground rocks and minerals, and it is released by precipitation, weathering of rocks and also through geothermal vents. And in the geosphere, sulfur, it is been seen as a deposition in the rock as well as it is a part of minerals, and through the process of precipitation and weathering of rocks and through geothermal vents, this sulfur that is been deposited in the earth get into the atmosphere or into the hydrosphere. Then next is biosphere. Biosphere, the sulfur get locked in living organism as a constituent of many proteins and cofactors. And in atmosphere, the sulfur is released into the atmosphere by burning of fossil fuels, volcanic activity and decomposition of organic molecules. So sulfur it is been released into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuel. So it result in the production of sulfur dioxide, and volcanic activity, it also lead to the production of sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, and decomposition of organic molecules. When organic molecules get decomposed, then it will result in the formation of hydrogen sulfide and sulfate. So these are some of the major reservoirs of sulfur in earth. Then we are moving into the sulfur cycle. So before getting into the sulfur cycle, the incorporation of sulfate into organic compounds. So sulfate in the form can be assimilated by plants as well as microorganisms, and the sulfate is assimilated by organisms such as plants, fungi and various prokaryote, and it is reduced to sulfide. Then sulfide is oxidized to organic sulfur, which is an essential component of protein. So sulfate, it is been utilized by this biotic community, and it is been oxidized it is been reduced to sulfide, and sulfide is then oxidized to sulfidyl groups or organic sulfur, which can be incorporated into various biomolecules. Assimilative sulfur reduction. So first step in sulfur cycle is assimilative sulfate reduction. In assimilative sulfate reduction, the sulfate is reduced to organic sulfidyl groups in organic sulfur compounds. So we have already told that this sulfate can be assimilated by plants and microorganisms. So this microorganism will reduce the sulfate into sulfidyl group, that is SH group. In cysteine, methionine and cysteine, the sulfur is present in the form of SH group. So it is been incorporated as organic sulfur. This reaction occurs in photosynthetic green and purple sulfur bacteria. So photosynthetic green bacteria and in purple sulfur bacteria, they can assimilate this sulfate in the soil into organic sulfidyl groups in their amino acids and corresponding proteins. And it has been also carried out by some chemolithotropic bacteria. The elemental sulfur in these bacteria are stored in the form of polysulfate. So in assimilative sulfate reduction, the sulfate is reduced to sulfidyl groups, or they are incorporated as organic sulfur in these molecules, in the biomolecules of these organisms. And next step is desulfurization. In desulfurization, the organic molecule containing sulfur is desulfurized, producing hydrogen sulfide gas. So in desulfurization, the organic sulfur that is been seen in these biomolecules get desulfurized, producing hydrogen sulfide gas. Mineralization of this organic sulfur takes place, producing hydrogen sulfide, elemental sulfur as well as sulfide mineral. So this desulfurization process actually takes place when this organism dies. So when the organism dies, their organic molecules get decomposed by microorganisms, and their sulfur present in this organic sulfur compounds get desulfurized, that it result in the production of hydrogen sulfide gas. So main component is product produced is hydrogen sulfide gas, and as it is a gas, it get escaped into the atmosphere, and some of this organic sulfur, it get converted into elemental sulfur as well as sulfide minerals. So elemental sulfur and sulfide minerals, it either get locked in the geosphere, or it will be washed into the hydrosphere. Then next is oxidation of hydrogen sulfide. Next step is oxidation of hydrogen sulfide. So the hydrogen sulfide thus produced as a result of this desulfurization process is oxidized to elemental sulfur. So hydrogen sulfide produced get oxidized to elemental sulfur, and certain photosynthetic bacteria from the families Chlorobiaceae and Chromatiaceae, they initiate this oxidation process. So This oxidation of hydrogen sulfide to elemental sulfur takes place, and it is being carried out by bacteria belonging to the family Chlorobiaceae and Chromatiaceae. Then next step is oxidation of this elemental sulfur. So first hydrogen sulfide is oxidized to elemental sulfur. Then this elemental sulfur is oxidized by sulfur-oxidizing bacteria to produce sulfate. So again the sulfate get into the soil. We start from the sulfate and now we end with the sulfate. So sulfate get mixed with the soil and it is being absorbed by plants and other microorganisms again. So this elemental sulfur, it is being oxidized to sulfate. Next is dissimilative sulfur and sulfate reduction. Dissimilative sulfur reduction is the first step. In dissimilative sulfur reduction, the elemental sulfur can be converted back to hydrogen sulfide. So, in the last step oxidation, the hydrogen sulfide is oxidized to elemental sulfur. So, here the reverse reaction is taking place, that is sulfur can be transformed into hydrogen sulfide. So, it is called a dissimilative sulfur reduction. So, here sulfur is being reduced to hydrogen sulfide, and in dissimilative sulfate reduction the sulfate produced can be reduced back to hydrogen sulfide. So in dissimilative sulfur reduction, sulfur is being reduced back to hydrogen sulfide, and in dissimilative sulfate reduction the sulfate produced can be reduced back to hydrogen sulfide. So this process is being carried out by microorganisms like Desulfurization, Desulfurization. So the bacteria that is responsible for the dissimilative sulfate reduction is Desulfurization, Desulfurization. So here the sulfate is being sulfate that is present in the soil is being reduced back to hydrogen sulfide. Next is role of microorganisms in this sulfur cycle. So role of microorganisms is that microorganism they help in this cycling of this sulfur through various biotic environment as well as through the abiotic environment. So first step is the decomposition of sulfur containing organic compound. So the microorganism help in the decomposition of sulfur containing organic compounds present in the soil. So protein degradation releases amino acids that contain sulfur. Elemental sulfur present in the soil cannot be utilized directly by the plants. Therefore, it is to be converted into sulfate by chemolithotropic bacteria. So as the organism get died, their waste materials accumulate in the soil, and this decomposing bacteria will decompose the sulfur containing organic compounds. So at first the protein degradation takes place, releasing amino acid that contain sulfur, and this elemental sulfur that is released, it cannot be utilized by the plants directly. Plants can only absorb the sulfate form. So therefore it is converted into sulfate by chemolithotropic bacteria. Next is reduction of the sulfate. Sulfate are reduced to hydrogen sulfide by Desulfurization, Desulfurization and Desulfurization bacteria. So the sulfate thus produced, most of the sulfate get absorbed by the plants, but some of the sulfate that is retained in the soil, it is being reduced to hydrogen sulfide by Desulfurization, Desulfurization and Desulfurization bacteria. So this reduction of sulfate, it takes place by two steps. It is a two-step process. Firstly, the sulfate are converted to sulfate utilizing ATP, and then the sulfate is reduced to hydrogen sulfate. So sulfate when converted to sulfide, at first it is been transformed into sulfide, and then it is been sulfite, and then the sulfate is being transformed into hydrogen sulfide. Then the oxidation of hydrogen sulfide to elemental sulfur. In presence of oxygen, the hydrogen sulfide is converted back to sulfur and then into sulfate by sulfur bacteria. So certain photosynthetic bacteria from the family Chlorobiaceae and Chromatiaceae initiate this oxidation process. sulfur-oxidizing bacteria, chemolithotropic bacteria that is living in hydrothermal vents oxidize hydrogen sulfide with oxygen to produce elemental sulfur and sulfate. So the chemolithotropic bacteria living in hydrothermal vents. Hydrothermal vents are region where this eruption of this sulfuric acid is been taking place. So large amount of heat is being generated and only microorganism can survive in such extreme hot springs. And this chemolithotropic bacteria that is living in this hydrothermal vents, they can oxidize hydrogen sulfide in presence of oxygen to produce elemental sulfur. So they are producing this elemental sulfur, and microorganisms that involved in this process are Thiomicrospira, HalothioBacillus and Begiatova. So these are the microorganisms that are living, or these are the chemolithotropic bacteria that are living in these hydrothermal vents, converting this hydrogen sulfide or oxidizing this hydrogen sulfide to elemental sulfur or sulfate. The produced sulfate usually combines with the leached calcium ion to form gypsum. So in hydrothermal vents, the calcium carbonate depositions were present there. So this produced sulfate, it usually combines with this calcium ions there to form gypsum. Next is some of the basic steps that is involved in this sulfur cycle. So we have already gone through the sulfur cycle, but this slide helps you to understand it better. The sulfur depositions in sediments is released by the natural weathering process. So we have already mentioned that sulfur is present in our geosphere as sediment depositions, or it is been deposited inside the rocks. So by natural weathering process, the sulfur that is locked in these sediments and rock get weathered, and that is being released into the either into the atmosphere or into the soil. The sulfur in presence of air, it is converted to sulfate. So the weathering process release sulfur into the environment, and this sulfur in presence of air, it is converted to sulfate. Sulfate can be utilized by plants and microbes and can be converted into organic form incorporated in proteins. Plants directly absorb sulfur containing amino acids such as methionine, cysteine and cysteine. This organic sulfur passes through the food chain. So from the plants and microbes, they enters to the animal world, and through food chain they get incorporated in the cells of all living organisms. This organic sulfur passes through the food chain. When the plants and animals die, the organic sulfur in them is decomposed by microbe and it is converted to H2S. So when all these living organisms die, the organic sulfur that is seen inside their cells, they are decomposed by the microbe and it is converted to hydrogen sulfide. In presence of oxygen, hydrogen sulfide, it is oxidized to sulfur, or then to sulfate by the sulfur bacteria. So at first the hydrogen sulfide is oxidized to sulfur, then sulfur is oxidized to sulfate, and again this sulfate can be utilized by the plants, and then again it gets incorporated into the living world. So several natural sources such as volcanic eruption, evaporation of water and breakdown of organic matter in swamps release sulfur directly into the atmosphere. So volcanic eruption is a source of sulfur. It will release sulfur in the form of sulfur dioxide. So it is a natural source. Then evaporation of water. We have already mentioned that in ocean, sulfate salt is dissolved in water. So evaporation of water will release sulfur into the atmosphere. And breakdown of organic matter in swamps, it also release sulfur in the form of hydrogen sulfide into the atmosphere. And this sulfur, various form of sulfur that is present in the atmosphere in the form of sulfur dioxide, sulfur monoxide and hydrogen sulfide, it is washed from the atmosphere into the earth through rain. So that is all for the sulfur cycle. And this is the diagrammatic representation of sulfur cycle. So here you have to incorporate the name of microorganisms that are involved in each and every step. Then only it will be complete. So in sulfur cycle, it first start from sulfate. This sulfate can be utilized by plants. So through assimilatory sulfate reduction, it get converted to organic sulfur compounds, and this organic sulfur compounds, from these organic sulfur compounds, as these organisms, all the living organism died, they get accumulated in the soil, and through mineralization they get converted into the sulfur compounds, organic sulfur get converted into sulfide, that is hydrogen sulfide, and this hydrogen sulfide on biological and chemical oxidation get converted to elemental sulfur, and some of the sulfur will get transformed back to sulfide. That process is called a dissimilative sulfur reduction. And the sulfur, it is again upon biological oxidation, that is by the action of microorganism, the sulfur get oxidized to sulfate, and again it is being incorporated in the living world. So this is the sulfur cycle. Thank you.